know the scene. Every year, leaders from all over the world get together for the UN Climate Conference, or COP. The latest one, COP28, got started in Dubai with a pretty clear, familiar game plan. But then the conference president himself said something in his opening remarks that just created a firestorm and a really fascinating puzzle. So yeah, let's get in.
So get this, that was the statement that just made jaws drop. You've got the head of a global climate summit, of all people, questioning the mean strategy, phasing out fossil fuels. And you have to wonder, right, why on earth would he say that? Well, to figure it out, we've got to look at this alternate narrative that our source material presents, which really takes apart the whole mainstream climate consensus.
You know, that quote didn't just come out of nowhere. It flew directly in the face of the official goals of the very conference he was supposed to be leading. And that contradiction, that weirdness, well, that's our doorway into a totally different way of thinking about the entire climate debate.
Okay, so here's the official playbook, right? The stuff you always hear about. We got to fight climate change, slash CO2 emissions, get rid of fossil fuels, and keep that global temperature rise under 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is the established script. And that's exactly why Al Jaber's comment was so jarring. It's this very foundation that our source material is about to challenge, starting with the science itself.
So let's dig into the first big piece of this alternate argument. The source claims that all those really dire predictions we hear about, about what the climate's going to look like in the future, they're based on computer models that are, well, just wrong. The whole idea is that these models are consistently predicting way more warming than what's actually happening.
The key phrase you'll hear over and over is that the models are running hot. So what does that mean? It basically means they're supposedly forecasting these huge, dramatic temperature spikes that just aren't matching up with what we're observing in the real world through actual measurements. So the big question is, how does the source even begin to back that up? And this right here gets to the absolute heart of the critique. The source points to testimony from an atmospheric scientist, Dr. John Christie, and it shows this huge gap. On one side, you have the computer models look at that steep upward climb in predicted temperature. But on the other side, you've got the actual data from things like satellites and weather balloons. And according to the source, that trend is much, much flatter. It's this disconnect between the prediction and reality that the whole argument is built on. And that leads us to Dr. Christie's pretty blunt conclusion. His argument is, look, because these models don't line up with what we're actually observing, they are untruthful. And here's the kicker. They're completely inappropriate to use as a basis for making these massive economy-changing policy decisions. So the real takeaway here is a fundamental challenge to the very tools we're using to predict our climate future. All right, let's shift gears to the second major argument. And this one reframes our entire relationship with carbon dioxide. The source material basically says, hold on a second. Instead of CO2 being this terrible pollutant, it's actually a vital gas for life on Earth. And get this, from a long-term geological point of view, our current CO2 levels are actually pretty low. So to make this point, the source wants us to rewind the clock way, way back. Think dinosaurs. During the Cretaceous period, a time when the planet was covered in lush forests and teeming with life, atmospheric CO2 was supposedly around 2,000 parts per million. Now, let's jump forward to today. We're sitting at about 417 parts per million. Now, yeah, that's higher than it was a couple hundred years ago, but the argument here is that when you look at the entire history of the planet, it's just a tiny fraction of what Earth has seen before. And then there's the UN's goal. Based on their target of a 45% cut, that would bring CO2 levels down to about 214 parts per million. The source presents this number not as a goal, but as a danger, arguing it would actually push Earth's climate back to a much colder, much harsher time. And this table really lays it all out. The source argues that the closest we can get to the UN's target climate is a period called the Pliocene epoch. Back then, with CO2 around 250 parts per million, the average global temperature was way colder. A full quarter of the planet's land was covered in ice. Forests were dying off, and huge mammals went extinct. And they contrast that with today, pointing to NASA data that shows our slightly warmer, higher CO2 world is literally greener than it was just 20 years ago. Okay, so if this narrative is saying that atmospheric CO2 isn't the big bad guy driving temperature, it begs a huge question, right? What is causing the warming that we see, especially in the oceans? And this is where we get to the most, well, fascinating part of the source's whole alternative theory. So the source proposes something pretty radical. The idea is that the main driver of climate change isn't coming from our atmosphere at all, but from deep inside the Earth itself.
The theory is that our planet is literally warming the oceans from the bottom up because of what's happening in its core. Now, to build this case, the source actually uses a statement from NASA, which confirms that, yeah, the vast majority of warming, like 90% of it, is happening in the oceans. So the source agrees with that fact, but it offers a completely different reason for why it's happening. So here's how they say it all works. First, you've got these things called mantle plumes, basically giant blobs of hot molten rock rising up from the Earth's deep interior. Second, as these plumes get close to the crust under the ocean, they heat up the ocean floor, especially under the Pacific. Third, this internal heat warms the ocean water from the bottom up. And fourth, and this is the real kicker, as the ocean gets warmer, it can't hold as much dissolved gas, so it releases CO2 into the atmosphere. So in this one theory, you have an explanation for both a warming ocean and rising CO2 levels. All right, let's get to the final piece of this whole puzzle. Because the source argues that this is not just a simple scientific disagreement. It frames the entire climate debate as a completely different kind of conflict, an information war, a battle for what we believe. The specific term the source material uses is fifth generational warfare. Now, that sounds pretty intense, right? But the idea is actually pretty simple. It's a type of conflict where the main battlefield isn't a physical place, it's your mind. The theory is that before you can make huge changes in society, you first have to shape how the public thinks. You create a story, a narrative, that makes people accept policies they would have otherwise rejected. It's a war of ideas. So here's the bottom line. From this perspective, all the climate hysteria we see isn't just a natural reaction to data. It's seen as a carefully crafted information campaign. And the ultimate goal, according to this narrative, isn't really about saving the planet. It's about justifying massive economic and social transformations that have very little to do with the climate itself. And that brings us to the final, really provocative question that the source material leaves you with. If the mainstream narrative is in fact a tool for change, then who actually benefits from having a global population that's afraid of a climate apocalypse? And maybe more importantly, what kind of new world are they trying to build on the back of that fear? It's a question that's really designed to make you think, not just about the data, but about the motivation behind the message.